I'm Carl, a historic preservation professional who loves digging up little known stories, and you are listening to Historic, the podcast about old places and people who love them. In each episode, I choose a historic place to roast and or toast, tell some interesting stories, and finally give it a score and place it on my official rad or bad list. Today's episode is about the 4th Avenue Theater in Anchorage, Alaska. Alaska became a state in 1959, 7 months before Hawaii. Those are the only two states that are younger than 100 years. The next youngest state is Arizona, which was admitted in 1912, making its age as a state 2 years older than Anchorage, the city, which was first surveyed in 1914. So you can see how it is a little difficult to choose a historic place for this episode. I've chosen to use the National Register of Historic Places to help identify my topics, and one of the biggest criteria for even being considered for that designation is being 50 years old. There just aren't a lot of buildings to even include on this list. Luckily, the 4th Avenue Theater is pretty interesting. First, let me tell you about the person who loved it. Austin Eugene, or Cap, Lathrop. Cap was born in Michigan in 1869, only a year after the invention of the hot water heater, and that will be relevant soon. He was just the kind of rugged, independent, opportunity-following, adventure-having kind of guy you would expect to leave a lasting mark on Alaska. When Cap was in 9th grade, he was accused of vandalizing the school's hot water heater, and they expelled him. Cap was a lot of things, but a hot water heater vandal, he was not. Eventually, the real culprit was discovered, and Cap was invited to return to the school. But in a move that may have inspired one James Ritchie decades later, he said, "F high school." Okay, there's no evidence that Kid Rock was inspired by Austin Lathrop dropping out of school on principle. It is true, though, that Cap did not return to school. And why would he? Would you? I would walk away with my long hair swinging and middle finger in the air. So would Kid Rock, and we all know it. In 1889, most of Seattle burned down in a great fire. Cap dropped everything and joined a wave of thousands of other brave American patriots hoping to get rich rebuilding the devastated city. His father owned a land clearing service in which he used draft horses, the really, really big ones, to pull up stumps and clear felled trees. He sent a team to Cap, who quickly lined up so much work that he expanded his business to 40 teams hauling building debris and clearing land for new construction. Within months of the fire, there was not only the need for rebuilding Seattle, but also housing a population that had doubled from people rushing in looking for work. Anyway, Cap was rich for a few years. He took a lucrative job building the Anacortes Railroad, but with so much of his money wrapped up in that project, a sudden economic depression in 1893 sent the investors he was counting on for payment to go bankrupt. Cap was broke and in debt overnight. He sold all of his properties and moved into a small house in Seattle. His real lucky day was when he was hanging around a seaside saloon trying to get someone to buy him a meal. He ran into an old acquaintance, a salty dog sailor named Captain Kelly. Kelly had some intel that gold had been discovered in the Cook Inlet of Alaska. Cap and Kelly quickly started planning their newest business venture. But Cap wasn't going to be a gold miner. He knew there would be a huge rush of his Seattle neighbors going north to Alaska. They could do all the hard work of extracting the gold, but Cap and Kelly knew the best way to get it south to be processed and sold was by boat. He was broke, but he still had his good credit, so he bought a boat. Now, I worry that I'm spending too much time on Austin Lathrop. To cut a long story short, Cap was rich again. In 1911, he was elected mayor of Cordova, Alaska, around the mountain and across the bay from Anchorage. A few years later, President Theodore Roosevelt closed the coal mines in the area, citing fears that wealthy businessmen would monopolize the area for a major profit. The bigger problem was that the people in Cordova used that coal to heat their homes. By 1911, the cost to import coal from Canada was $15 a ton. That's 5 times more than the $3 that it cost to use local coal from those mines that had been shut down. So, in perhaps his greatest act of defiance, Cap led a charge to board a ship where he and several other men shoveled nearly a ton of coal into the sea. I thought this was going to be pretty cool because I like a good protest. It seemed like a good cause and no one got hurt. Some big company just lost like $15. No big deal. On one hand, Cap and company stopped as soon as the police showed up. So it feels kind of like a disappointing protest. On the other hand, at least they didn't dress up like natives to hide their identities and deflect punishment to an already worse off group, as in the Boston Tea Party that they were comparing themselves to. So they were better than those guys, at least. After that, Cap contacted the territorial government, which resulted in nothing happening. But now we get super relevant. That was around the time that Cap built his first movie theater, the Empress, in Cordova. In 1923, he produced a full-length film, the first one to be made in Alaska, Chichakos, about the Klondike Gold Rush. It did well in Alaska, but never gained relevance outside of the region. I would love to play a short clip of it, but it's a silent film. So I'll just include a link in the description of the episode. How about that? Uh, After this, he stuck with theaters as far as being in the movie business. And now we can talk about the old place of this episode, the Fourth Avenue Theater. I know I have a little bit of snark on this podcast when it comes to rich people doing rich things in their expensive buildings. And so far, this episode has been no different. But I do want to point out that this building is different. While Cap had some help from his dad when he went to Seattle, he became, at one point, the richest man in Alaska, and largely from his own business acumen and by taking risks with his own money. His movie theater business marked a change from being purely capitalistic to having a desire to build something for the community. Anchorage, of course, is in a very cold climate. Even in summer, it's rare for it to be what I would consider hot. Winter is plagued by short, foggy days and long, dark nights. It's basically hell on earth for folks with seasonal depression. Cap was interested in not just making money, but offering some kind of recreation opportunity and community gathering place. His theaters made sense and were wildly popular, and they were hardly his most profitable businesses anyway. And he would often open the doors and show free films, especially around the holidays. So, as much as I get snarky about rich people in their rich buildings doing rich people things, Cap was actually pretty cool for a rich dude. Construction on the Fourth Avenue Theater started in 1941, but the start of World War II made supplies scarce and costly. It was unfortunate, but this did give Cap an opportunity to rethink his plan, and what he ended up finally opening in 1947 was much more grand and opulent than what was initially going to be built. Approaching the entrance at the ground level, moviegoers would pass a facade of travertine, which is a sedimentary rock that you'll probably recognize if you Google it. It's a light-colored stone with a smooth, understated pattern. Imagine something between marble and granite with its pattern, although it's not as hard as either one of those rocks. The travertine was worked and applied in a sort of large tiled manner with accents designed to look like wooden molding. A small overhang covering the sidewalk between the ground floor and the second floor has rounded corners and neon tubes running the length of the outer edge. The three floors above the ground floor have an almost overbearing look. When I first looked at this building, the harsh squared corners and minimal windows gave me immediate brutalist vibes, only the concrete structure was most recently painted pink and blue. Other photos show that it had been yellow as well. Once I took a closer look, the Art Deco elements really popped out as well. Probably the defining feature of the Fourth Avenue Theater has to be the 4-story high vertical sign. It begins at the marquee, which was added in the 1950s, and rises straight up, capped with distinctively sharp angled points and a rounded top. To the left and right behind the sign is a stepped facade, also topped with sharp steps, taking the eye from the top of the central column to the main part of the building a few feet below. Inside is where patrons got the full Art Deco experience of this building. The main floor of the auditorium had 680 seats, and the second floor balcony, which was reached by ascending a grand staircase, sat 280 people. This entire lobby area had lush carpeting and rails and banisters carved from walnut. The most unique and notable features include 4 murals. A pair of floor-to-ceiling pieces flanking either side of the movie screen depicted the commercial and industrial growth of Alaska. In the lobbies were 2 others. One, a painting of Mount McKinley, the Alaskan mountain that is the highest in North America. The final mural was made up of multiple squares, each painted with distinctly Alaskan wildlife. This one was the most interesting to me, as it is designed as a metallic bas relief with gold-colored animal depictions on a silver background. Inside the auditorium, the high ceiling was like a huge Alaska flag. Its tiles were painted dark blue and featured the Big Dipper and the North Star, the stars that remain illuminated as the main lights went down. It's only appropriate as Alaska made Cap a rich man. In a way, Cap even made Alaska. But mostly, Cap made this theater for his Alaskan neighbors. The Fourth Avenue Theater showed films for nearly 40 years, long outliving Cap, who died in a mining accident in 1950. Besides the theater auditorium, the building housed several businesses over the years. Notably, it was home to local television and radio stations. At one point, a rooftop penthouse apartment was built, making the theater 5 stories tall. As film technology changed and newer theaters opened up with multiple auditoriums, many of these older 1 or 2 screen theaters had trouble adapting. Some found new life running films after they had been out for their main theater run, and new movies were released. The Fourth Avenue Theater was one that simply closed. For around 30 years, interest in restoring the theater to its former glory came and went in waves. One of the issues with these old buildings is the huge expense of updating them, and that was ultimately the nail in the coffin for the Fourth Avenue Theater. In August 2022, fences went up around the once grand building. By mid-November, it was gone. We all know the story, wherever we live. A developer comes in with big plans to revitalize a downtown or to stuff a bunch of houses in a field. In Anchorage, it was a $200 million complex taking over the entire block with housing, office space, retail, entertainment venues. Although early renderings of this massive project showed the Fourth Avenue Theater's facade incorporated into the plan, the new owners simply razed the building. Citizens tried everything. They appealed to the mayor of Anchorage, Dave Bronson. He gave his full support to the developers. Preservation groups wrote to Governor Mike Dunleavy, whose office claims it never received a letter. I'm not saying it's right or it's wrong. Maybe it's the only way. It definitely feels like the Alaskan way. The state has 14 properties on the official list of properties removed from the National Register of Historic Places. I didn't take the time to investigate each one of them, but several of them were removed due to having been torn down. As I was trying to select a place for this episode, my previous two selections had both been torn down, even though they're still on the list. Then this one, of course, was torn down. I'm sure Alaska's State Historic Preservation Officer will get those buildings removed at some point. It can take many years for the administrative work to happen to get them off the National Register of Historic Places. But still, Alaska doesn't have a huge number of historic buildings and sites to begin with. In 1964, Alaska experienced the biggest earthquake ever recorded in North America and the second biggest on Earth since the invention of the seismograph. Hundreds of structures crumbled during that event before the National Register was even a thing. Even several buildings around Anchorage were destroyed, while the Fourth Avenue Theater stood strong. Whether the building actually needed to come down is a debate far beyond me. The fact that it simply happened is a massive failure on the part of Anchorage and ought to be an embarrassment to Mayor Bronson. Despite what many believe, the National Register does nothing to restrict private property rights. It does create restrictions on federal government property, and most, if not all, states have created similar restrictions for state and local government property. Where I think Anchorage failed is not using the National Register for its intended purpose as a resource for city planning. I get that property owners don't want to be restricted. I, for one, hope I never live in an HOA because I will be very upset about giving money to my neighbors so they can write me up for mowing my lawn incorrectly. Like, forget about it. But incorporating a historic preservation commission doesn't create any more unreasonable restrictions on a property than requiring building permits or code inspections. It's just one more hoop, and it can be as simple as requiring a review of building plans and justifying to a committee why you need to tear down the building or paint it some weird color. Most preservation commissions I'm familiar with can be easily overruled by the city council anyway. It's really not a big deal. It's just a sad ending. Maybe necessary, probably not necessary, definitely sad. A property on the National Register of Historic Places has been deemed valuable and important to the community it is in, if not the entire country. I think someone buying one of those properties is also buying the responsibility of doing everything they can to protect that resource. Because it's not just their property, it's not just important to them, it's important to the community. This developer who tore down the Fourth Avenue Theater and the mayor who supported them all the way to the end without a hint of remorse or reasonable effort to save the building, essentially gave all of Alaska, to quote Kid Rock again, "Give the next generation a big OQ!" With all of that behind us, it's time to determine where the Fourth Avenue Theater stands on the rad or bad list. Let's go over the rules really quick. I have 10 categories in which I will rate each building I talk about on a scale of 1 to 10, plus a mansard multiplier, because mansard roofs are the best roofs. I'm still looking for one. A score of 50 or higher means the building is rad. Under 50, and the building is bad. So let's get to the list. For architectural significance, I gave it a 3. It was a theater. Architecturally, it was a little bit confusing. I thought it was more brutalist, but there were some weird Art Deco vibes. It was just kind of a strange mix of styles, I think. For historical importance, I give it a 5. It's kind of middle of the road. Theaters were a big part of life. They were very important in Anchorage and in Alaska, a place where for a large part of the year, you can't really have outdoor adventures. So it's somewhat important. It's not massively important, but it's not unimportant either. For cultural impact, I am going with a 6. Again, it's kind of middle of the road, a little bit higher just because it was such an important building. If you look on some of the Facebook groups about Anchorage history, people have great memories of going to this theater and seeing the movies. And they loved looking up at the ceiling and seeing the stars from the flag lit up above them. For preservation efforts, sorry, Anchorage, you get a 0. Your local government sold you out. Mayor Bronson, in particular. Seriously, like this is going to happen again in your city without some kind of legitimate historic preservation ordinance. You are going to continue to lose buildings such as the Fourth Avenue Theater. And like I said, I love private property rights. I'm not even implying that the owner of a historic property should be forbidden from doing anything to it. I just think that extra hoop to jump through of having a historic preservation ordinance and requiring approval to make huge changes like ripping down a historic building will force owners to slow down, seriously consider their plans, and justify them to a board of people representing the community. And if you don't have those ordinances and commissions in place, your collective history is not safe, Anchorage. And here's a great example: you get a 0 for preservation efforts. Visual appeal, I gave it a 6. It's a kind of an overbearing feeling building. It has some hints of Art Deco, which I love. An Art Deco building will always rank higher on my list. And that's just, it's my list, so I'm allowed to do that. But the almost brutalist features of that building kind of bring it down a little bit. And then once you go inside, it's absolutely beautiful again. For stories and anecdotes, I gave it a 3. There aren't a whole lot of stories tied to this other than, people's personal memories of going to the theater with their friends. But that is a common thing with any theater. Any theater, no matter how unique it is, or if you go to the ones now that are just like every other theater, you still have these good memories of going there with your friends, getting popcorn and whatever, and watching a movie. You're going to have the same positive emotions tied to that particular theater as people who remember the Fourth Avenue Theater. For public access, again, you get a 0. It's gone. There is nothing to access. The developer at this point hasn't made any visible effort, no effort that I can find online sitting in my basement, to even build something to access. So at this point, the building is just gone. The property is fenced up. There's nothing there to access. It's not the original building. It's not a new building. It's just nothing. For uniqueness, I gave it a 6. It's a theater. Every theater is going to be roughly similar in style. This one is unique enough that I think it stands out as a theater, but it's not quite enough to push it super above average for a theater of its time period. Wow factor, I gave it a 5. Same reason. I don't know how many more times I can try to repeat that same phrase and make it sound different. Like it's a cool building and I wish it still existed. The interior is where it really shines, but it just doesn't stand out as something that makes you go, wow, that is an awesome theater. For Carl's choice, this is where I just give it a score, which I guess is the whole list. Like, I'm not consulting other people on this list. I am doing this list. But for Carl's choice, where I just give it a score, I gave it an 8. I mostly felt bad about those couple of zeros that I threw in there. And so I wanted to boost the score a little bit. So I gave it an 8. There is no Mansard multiplier. I still have yet. This is, my 5th episode. I still don't have a building with a mansard roof to review. I've seen a couple that I want to. I haven't quite decided on one yet. So not to ruin any spoiler alerts here. So not to give away any spoilers here, but we may have a Mansard multiplier on the list very soon. I don't know. I'm looking at a few and considering them. So that gives us a total score for the 4th Avenue Theater in Anchorage, Alaska of 42. Unfortunately, that means that we have found our first entry on the bad list. This building is not good, and it's those zeros that really screwed you over. All right, so call your mayor, call your city council, say, this guy in Utah is doing this podcast about old buildings, and he says that Anchorage is failing at history, and he put one of our buildings on the bad list, and we don't like it. So let's do something about it. Okay, don't get mad at me. It's my list, but it's your city officials who are failing you, Anchorage. So, use me. Be like, this guy in Utah is embarrassing us on the internet, and we have to do something about it. I'm totally cool with that. I will be Anchorage's bad guy, although I would like to visit someday, so I don't want to be banned from your city. That's all for this episode. If you are into this sort of thing, please subscribe anywhere you're listening to this podcast. I'm on several apps. Leave a rating or a review on whatever app you use to listen. Check out my Linktree link in the episode description. Thanks for listening. Go out and do something historic. I'm Carl the Human.